At 6 years old, did Jane Goodall have an interest in animals?
Long before I was 6. So people say, when did your interest begin or what triggered it? I was born that way. And so the story my mother tells, obviously when you're 1.5, you don't remember. But the story my mother tells is she came into my room to say goodnight, and my bed was full of earth and worms. And, she was so supportive. So instead of being angry, she just said, Jane, I think they'll die if we don't put them back in the garden. So we put them back. But she said, you were looking at them so intently. It looked as though you were wondering, how do they walk without legs? So anyway, my first real experience of animal behavior was when I was 4.5. And we lived in London, not so many animals. Mum took me for a holiday onto a farm, proper farm, not one of these terrible factory farms. And I was given a job to collect the hens' eggs. So the hens, I think there were about, 8 little wooden hen houses where they slept at night. And around the edge were the nest boxes. So I'd take my little basket and open the box, and if there was an egg. Apparently I began asking everybody, but where's the hole? Where's the hole where the egg comes out? Because I couldn't see a hole like that. So nobody satisfied my curiosity. And what I remember vividly is seeing this hen going into one of the hen houses, and I must have thought, she's going to lay an egg. So I crawled after her. Big mistake, squawks of fear, she flew out. And again, in that little 4.5-year-old mind, I must have thought, well, no hen will lay an egg here because it's dangerous. So I went into an empty hen house. Apparently, I waited 4 hours, which was fine for me, but Mum didn't know where I was. And it was getting towards the evening, and she'd actually called the police. And there's this excited little girl rushing towards the house. How many mothers would have grabbed that child? How dare you go off? Where have you been? Don't you dare do it again. She saw my eyes shining and sat down to hear the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. And so the reason I love that story, isn't that the making of a little scientist? Curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning patience.
And
a different kind of mother might have crushed that.
Yeah, that's lasted your whole life through. And at school, were you always interested in biology and the animal world?
Yeah, unfortunately, our biology mysteries was, when I was at my first little school, we had a teacher who took us out on nature walks, and that was wonderful. I still remember her. But then when I got into, the secondary school, our teacher really didn't like animals. She was frightfully embarrassed by anything like mating. She wouldn't talk about that. She liked plants. And so, I wanted to actually do zoology, but it wasn't taught at school.
And yet, it still came through. I mean, regardless of having bad teaching.
I had books. Yes. And of course, when I was growing up, there was no TV. It hadn't been invented. So it was always books. And you must have read Dr. Dolittle.
Yes.
So it was Dr. Dolittle taking animals back to Africa from the circus. And then when I was 10, I found this little second-hand book. We had very little money, and I could just afford it. And it was called Tarzan of the Apes. Oh. So I read it from cover to cover, fell passionately in love as little girls of 10 can. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. Right? Of course, I knew there wasn't a Tarzan, but I was 10 years old when the dream began. I will go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them.
Really? At that age?
At that age.
Your whole future was effectively mapped out.
It was sort of mapped out, but, everybody laughed at me. How will you get there? The war's raging. Africa's far away, you don't have money, and you're just a girl.
A girl, yes.
So, but my mother said, if you really want something like this, you're going to have to work awfully hard, and, don't give up, and maybe you'll find a way. So that's the message I take around the world, particularly to young people in disadvantaged communities. And I wish Mum was alive to know how many people have come up to me and said, Jane, I want to thank you because you taught me that because you did it, I can do it too.
Yes. Now, let's spool forward, 22 years when you got to know Louis Leakey in Kenya?
Yeah.
How did that happen? How did you make that first contact with him?
Well, we couldn't afford university. So it was just enough money for a secretarial, boring shorthand typing, the old manual typewriters and shorthand and stuff. And so I got this job in London, and then came a letter from a school friend whose parents had bought a farm in Kenya, and she invited me for a holiday. So to save up the money for the fare, I had to go home. You can't save in London, not really, but not with that little bit of money. And I worked as a waitress, and that's in Bournemouth. The hotel is still there where I worked as a waitress. Earned my fare, and it had to be a return. And what's Tanzania today was Tanganyika. It was sort of part of the crumbling outposts of the crumbling British Empire. And the boat, because there were no planes then, not really, not with tourists. So it was a boat. And the boat had to go all the way around Cape Town because the Suez Canal was closed with that war with Egypt. And I was 23 years old. Anyhow, very exciting voyage. And first place I set foot on African soil was Cape Town. And it was, well, you've been to Cape Town, Table Mountain and everything. But it was the height of apartheid. So on every seat, every door, it said, Slex Blanc. And my friends there said, white people only. And I hated it then because I didn't grow up that way. My grandfather was a congregational minister. Anyway, we sailed on and got to Kenya, stayed with my friend, and somebody said, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis Leakey. So I went to see him at the museum, Natural History Museum. Now, I told you I had that boring secretarial training. 2 days before I met Louis, his secretary had walked out. He needed a secretary, and there I was.
Fantastic.
I mean, isn't that, you just
If you'd
don't
had
know.
a BA or an MA from a university, you wouldn't have been there, would you?
No,
You'd have done something completely different.
yes.
Isn't that extraordinary? Yes, yes. And so he then hired you as his secretary.
Yes,
is that
he
right?
took me all around. I think he was impressed I knew so much because I'd read every book there was on the planet. And then so there I am in a world where people can answer all my questions about the animals and the plants, the whole lot. And he took me on a safari to Olduvai Gorge. It was just his wife, himself, me, one other young English girl, and I think there were about 6 Africans searching for fossils, human fossils.
And they'd started finding them by that
They
stage.
hadn't.
They hadn't?
The Leakeys believed that they would find humans there. They believed that these round, smooth stones he thought they were bolus stones.
Yes.
Everybody else laughed at him, but he and Mary were sure that there were early humans there. And of course, the year after I was there, they found them.
Yes.
But I didn't care about the fossils. There were animals everywhere then.
Yes.
There were, one evening, Gillian and I were allowed to walk out on the plains, and there was a rhino about as far away as the wall over there. Luckily, the wind was going from him to me, and, they don't see very well. And then one evening, it was a young male lion. And that was really, Gillian and I were forced to take these 2 dogs on our walks without leads, which, when there's lions and leopards, that's a bit stupid. And one of them was Mary Leakey's champion of all breeds of Kenya, a Dalmatian. And Mary Leakey, I don't know if you ever met her, but she was very scary.
Yeah.
And Gillian and I we're walking along the gorge, and suddenly in front of us, a tiny little mouse goes running across the trail. And of course, the dogs take off after the mouse. And something made me look behind. And again, about as far away as the wall there's this young male lion. He's probably about 2 years old. And anyhow, I said to Gillian, well, we better climb out of the gorge onto the plain. It seemed to me it's safer. But we couldn't leave the dogs. I mean, it was more scary to meet Mary Leakey without her prize dog than the lion. So finally we got the dogs out, and I had a belt and Gillian had, I don't know, something. So we climbed up the gorge. The lion had disappeared. Gillian let go of the champion of all breeds of Kenya, who went straight back to the mouse. I was all prepared to go back and look for her, but luckily she came.
So there were lions, there were rhinos and so on, but were there chimpanzees?
No, but Leakey had been wanting someone to study chimps because he was studying early man, and he felt sure, as we now know is true, that there was a common ancestor, ape-like human, about 6 million years ago.
You say he felt sure, but there was no evidence of this at the time.
Not back then. It was in his mind.
And he spotted that.
Yeah, so he, from these skeletons and skulls, you can find out, does the creature walk upright? From the tooth where you get roughly an idea what sort of things it was eating, but behavior doesn't fossilize. And he wanted to know how Stone Age man might have behaved. So he reckoned if Jane can find behavior in chimps that's similar to human behavior today, maybe that was in the common ancestor. And we brought it with us along our separate evolutionary pathway. So that would give him an idea of how Stone Age men and women might have behaved.
Was he right about that?
He was right.
The whole thing? I mean, the whole
thing.
pattern of it.
In fact, if you read, talks about how early humans might have behaved, you find reference to chimps.
Really?
Because they're genetically, we differ from them only by just over 1%.
Yes.
With our DNA.
I know a lot of people that don't differ from them by any percent.
That is very rude to the chimps.
Oh, sorry. Oh, God.
If you're thinking of who I'm thinking of.
You're sounding like Mary Leakey. Do you remember the first time you came across a chimp in the wild? You must do.
First time, for 4 months, they flippin' ran away every time they saw me. They'd never seen a white ape before. And, so all I was learning was from this peak I found with my binoculars. They weren't very good binoculars. We had so little money. It was just from a wealthy American businessman. And so it was, those early months were depressing because I knew if I didn't see something exciting, 6 months' money we had would run out. And that would be the end. And the worst thing was letting Leakey down because he really stuck his neck out. I had no degree, come straight out from England.
And
the breakthrough came when the first chimp who began to lose his fear, and through my binoculars I saw him sitting on a termite mound, breaking off grass stems, pushing them down into the termite mound and eating off the termites. And I saw him break off a leafy twig, and to make that into a tool, he had to remove the leaves. And at that time, science thought humans and only humans use and make tools. We were defined as man, the tool maker.
So when you saw this chimp, what was his name? He had a
David Greybeard.
That's right.
Yes. David Greybeard.
When you saw him do that, was that a sort of an amazing moment for you?
It was an amazing moment because I knew, I had read a book called The Mentality of Apes about a colony of captive chimps by a German psychologist. And it's an amazing book. In fact, they've recently republished it. And it talked about how chimps could use tools and things. But scientists disregarded it because they said, but they were captive, so they just learned it from humans. So when I saw it, it didn't surprise me, but I knew that Leakey would be absolutely thrilled and that science would have to change its mind. But you can imagine what the scientists said. Well, why should we believe her? She's just a girl. She
No
hasn't been to
degree.
college.
Yes.
They were disbelieving. But luckily, that observation let Leakey go to the Geographic Society, and they not only agreed to give funding when the 6 months ran out, but they sent Hugo van Lauwijk, photographer, filmmaker, to record what I was by then observing more and more chimp behavior.
You married him later.
I married him too, yes.
That always helps.
And the Geographic actually wanted him to film me as much as chimps, which was extremely irritating.
What is it about chimps that attracts you more than, I don't know, lions or...
Oh, I would have studied anything. Honestly, I just wanted to study wild animals, but chimps are fascinating because they're so like us. So it really does help us to think a little bit about our relationship with other animals. And, you know, once I began to get the trust of the chimps when they greet each other, well, we demonstrated a greeting, kissing, embracing. They hold hands. If one is nervous and approaches, it may be patted in reassurance. They beg for food like this. When the males compete for dominance, they're upright, they're swaggering, they're shaking their fists, their lips are bunched in a furious scowl. They look as big and intimidating as they possibly can. And that reminds me very much of certain male politicians.
Yeah. Actually, it reminds me of a BBC editorial meeting, really. But, yes, but how, and so one chimp, the greybeard one, kind of accepted you, or accepted the fact that you were...
Yes, he realized I wasn't scary. So
Yes.
after that, you know, he got more and more used to me. And if he was with a group, because chimps don't travel in a troop, sometimes alone, sometimes a mum with her kids, sometimes two mums, sometimes a little group of males hanging out, just occasionally the whole community gathering when there's a new food. And so if I would approach a group, they were ready to run as usual, but if David was there, they just looked from him to me, and I suppose they thought, well, she can't be so dangerous after all. And so, you know, gradually I got to know them. David's best friend was Goliath, the top-ranking male, and then there was old Mr. McGregor and Mike, and top-ranking female Flo, and Passion, and all the kids. You know, I got to know them like my family.
And so you'd be sitting there, you wouldn't need binoculars because you were quite close
By
to
then, yeah. But even so, you know, they're still up in the trees a lot.
Yes.
And I was always interested in mother-infant behavior. And a lot of it, you've really got to be totally concentrated because there's little things that go on that you wouldn't notice if you didn't have that detail.
And you were writing notes?
Writing just by hand to start with.
Taking photographs, did you? I haven't seen a photograph. I haven't seen a video of you taking photographs. Did you take a lot?
Well, right at the beginning, no, because I couldn't get near enough. And then later, Hugo took most of the photographs.
Yes. But you were just describing their kind of moment-by-moment behavior.
Yes, everything I could see.
And this was all done in the early stages for Leakey.
Yes, that's right.
He must have been absolutely delighted.
He was thrilled. And then, of course, I had this shock of finding that they're brutal as well and capable of a kind of war and kill each other. But they also show love and compassion and altruism. So, you know, they're so like us. And it was clear there wasn't a sharp line between them and us.
I mean, they can be quite violent, quite unattractive in their violence.
Yeah, just like us.
Like us.
Yeah, I mean, they're about 8 times stronger than me, at
Really?
least. Yeah.
They can do a lot of damage.
They could. They wanted to. Luckily, they've never wanted to hurt us.
Did you see, when did you start to see that side of the chimpanzee?
Well, it wasn't for about a year when I began to be able to follow them, because males patrol the boundary of the territory, and if they see strangers, that's individuals from a neighboring community, they become very quiet and they touch each other and look, and then they'll creep. I mean, they literally creep. Sometimes they'll go from rock to rock through dry grass, or they'll climb a tree and sit looking out over the neighboring territory, totally silent. And then if they see an individual, they do these brutal gang attacks. And leave the victim
they
to
kill
die.
each other.
Yeah, well, they leave them to die. And then sometimes, like 2 weeks later, you see them go back to where this attack took place, looking kind of horrible.
Yes.
It was a big shock.
Was it? It must have been, yes. Because we didn't know about anything about all that kind of stuff, did we? And we have a rather, perhaps, I don't know, kind of rather a sort of nice view of animals.
Yeah.
We don't want to think that they do these things.
Yeah, we don't much like Tennyson's Red in Tooth and Claw,
Yeah.
but it's
But
true.
important, of course, just as important as the tool, use of tools.
Oh, yes. In fact, more in a way.
Yeah.
More in a way. You know, they can live to be 50 or more years in the wild. And there's these strong bonds between families, between brothers and sometimes brothers and sisters, certainly mothers and young.
Okay, so here is a young woman who has really only by that stage got secretarial qualifications.
And waitressing, don't
And
forget.
waitressing, I mustn't forget the waitressing. And she's coming back and she's telling the world that chimpanzees do these things that nobody had ever dreamt that. What was the response? Did everybody just accept it, or did they?
Oh, no. Well, it was very interesting, actually, because after about 2 years, Leakey wrote to me and said, I won't always be here to get money for you. You have to stand on your own 2 feet. You need a degree. We don't have time for an undergraduate degree. I've got you a place in Cambridge University to do a PhD in ethology. I didn't even know what ethology meant. It's just behavior. But, you know, scientists like to use these difficult words. I think it makes them feel important. But anyway, so when I got there, nervous, you can imagine. And so many of the professors told me I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have named the chimpanzees. That wasn't scientific. They should have had numbers. I couldn't talk about their personalities. I couldn't
Why?
talk
They
about
didn't have personalities, did they?
personalities. Only humans had personalities. Only humans had minds capable of problem solving. Only humans had emotions. And to apply that to any other animal was the worst sin, anthropomorphism, applying human behavior to non-human creatures. But luckily, as a child, I had this wonderful teacher. And he had taught me that in this respect, these professors were totally wrong. That teacher was my dog. You can't share your life with an animal and not know that we're not the only beings with personalities, minds, and emotions.
Well, it seems so obvious now, but I mean, we're talking, what was this, the early 60s?
Yes.
So not that long ago.
And I was actually taught that the difference between us on our peak and all the other animals was a difference of kind. And I think that must have come from religion.
Yes.
And you know, there's a mistranslation of a word in the Bible. In Genesis, we read that man was given dominion over, you know, the animals in the Bible. Actually, the original Hebrew was something more like stewardship. That's very different.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. How interesting. So they tried to beat all this out of you at Cambridge. And you weren't prepared to let them beat it out of you.
No.
And did you feel, I mean, you'd got all the observational stuff, you'd got notebooks full of all this, and these were people, presumably, who didn't really see chimpanzees in the wild at all. I mean,
No, luckily I had a wonderful supervisor, Professor Robert Hine. He was one of the very early and one of the 3 top ethologists in Europe, because it was a new science. And they tried to make it a hard science, and actually it's not a hard science. And I was told you can't be a good scientist unless you're completely coldly objective. You mustn't show empathy. Well, I think that comes of being a woman, perhaps, because it was, to me, so wrong. Yet anyway, Robert Hine came, he was very critical, but then he came to Gombe. And after 2 weeks, he wrote to me and said, Jane, I'm sorry, actually, I've learned more about animal behavior in these 2 weeks than all the rest of my life together.
Gosh,
So,
what a moment,
yeah.
Jane. Yes.
So what he then did, I mean, it was so magic for me that I had him. He taught me to think like a scientist. He taught me to question everything that I thought was true, to examine it, and to test it myself. And I loved doing that. We were a perfect match.
And you got your doctorate.
I got my doctorate.
Did people accept Dr. Jane Goodall where they hadn't accepted Ms. Jane Goodall?
Well, they began to, but of course the Ms. Jane Goodall, I mean, you know, she's only got famous because of, she's a geographic cover girl. It's just her legs. So when people say to me now,
I had
"Oh,
those legs on my...
well, you know, people say to me now, well, weren't you, I mean, isn't that sexist and terrible to talk about? And I say, well, you know, I mean, we didn't have money. The Geographic wanted somebody who, well, probably I wasn't exactly ugly, was I? And, you know, if my legs help me, thank you, legs. You know, they actually were pretty good legs.
Yes, no. I can vouch for that. So, and you were aware, were you, that the thought, that scientific thought was changing in the direction that you were hoping to lead it in? Is that right?
And I think it was, you know, because the chimps are also biologically so like us. You know, this DNA that is so close, and similarities in the immune system and structure of the blood and the anatomy of the brain. So it was really lucky. It was the chimps. And then there was Hugo's film and photographs and my notes. So science just gradually had to come out of that very reductionist way of thinking.
And that was the start of a revolution.
Yes. Because then, you know, once you accept that we're part of and not separate from the animal kingdom, then what about all the others?
And you see more and more evidence, don't you? I mean, I don't know, my authority for this seems to be the Daily Mail, I'm afraid. But, you know, they're interested in these sort of subjects, and I read on a regular basis of all sorts of animals you wouldn't expect to have.
John, when you get home, will you Google not Picasso the artist, but Pigcasso? Pigcasso lives in Cape Town.
Oh, the artist
Yes.
Chimp.
And her paintings are selling for about $5,000.
Yes.
I have one. I won't sell it. But if you, I mean, seriously, all of you, just look up Picasso. Choose the geographic one. There's 3 that come up if you Google it. And it's one, you'll just love it. And then this is ratty. So there's also a YouTube of 5 smart rats. They've all got names. And you know these tests that dogs do, I think they call them agility tests. They go through a tunnel and up a seesaw and down, and you know that thing, jump. Well, these 5 rats, you will be amazed at what they do. They do the whole thing the dogs do. And Ratty is actually demonstrating a giant forest rat of Africa, and they've been trained to detect the smell of the explosive in landmines, TNT, and you know what the landmines do when they're left after a civil war, all the people who lose feet and legs. These guys can sniff them out, and they do a little scratch. I've watched them being trained. They're trained just near Dar es Salaam. and they're absolutely delightful. They're about this big. And so they've now been credited with being partially responsible for clearing Mozambique of landmines.
Extraordinary.
And they're now taught, some of them can sniff out ivory, some sniff rhino horn, some sniff pangolin scales.
Really?
And they have the advantage over the dogs because they can climb up the crates.
Yeah.
And they can scratch up at the top.
I mean, what you're saying is only what we all know about with our dogs and cats, that they've got characteristics and abilities which are individuated. I mean, they're you know, it's not just a kind of dopey mass.
No.
It's individuals who can behave, and really that does come from you, doesn't it?
Well,
Our
I suppose
awareness
it sort
of
of
it.
began there, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Well,
So-
certainly in the scientific sense.
Yes. So after Cambridge, you went back to Gombe?
Yeah, and I started a little research station with students coming out. And I could spend hours in the rainforest. And, you know, those were the best days of my whole life, seeing how everything was interconnected and each little species had a role to play in this amazing tapestry of life. And also, I felt real strongly a spiritual connection to the natural world, which I think has helped me in my life anyway. So they were
Spiritual
definitely the best.
in what sense, Jane? I mean, in a religious
Feeling that there
sense?
is a power out there. And what's fascinating me today is that some of the very top brains in physics, physicists and so on, they come separately to conclusions there is intelligence behind the universe. You know, one of my really good friends now is the director of National Institutes of Health in America, and he led the team that unraveled the human genome, and he started off as an agnostic, and he said, Jane, there's no way, when you see that each cell has billions of neurons in it, and the cell is directed to develop into a toenail or a kidney or an eyebrow, he said, there's no way that has anything to do with chance. And when people say, well, it all, you know, the universe began with the Big Bang, that's pretty well proven. But what was before the Big Bang?
So you would regard yourself as a
I don't really
Christian?
know what to call. I mean, I grew up in a Christian family. My grandfather was a congregational minister. My mother was always very wise. She said, well, you grew up in a Christian family, so you worship a God, but you might have been born a Muslim, and then it would have been Allah, or you might have been born, you know, somewhere in India and be a Buddhist. She said, it has to be all the same. If there's whatever, we don't know, do we? I mean, I don't.
But of course, I mean, it's only fair to say probably most scientists wouldn't agree with that. The
They're
idea of an
beginning to,
intelligent...
but they're changing. That's why I say some of the best brains. Have you ever met Ervin Laszlo?
No.
He's said to be the #1 philosopher of science in Europe. He survived the Holocaust. And he keeps getting me to write things for his books about who are we and why are we here, which I find fascinating.
Let's go back to Gombe. So you're getting students in by now. It's what am I trying to say? I mean, you've got enough money to keep
No
going.
fighting every year.
Really?
Money's always been the biggest problem.
Money to keep
the place going.
Keep it going.
You know, and then at a certain time we got a big grant from a foundation in America. We were working a little bit with Cambridge and with Stanford in America, and so they were supporting students. But there was always money to be found. You know, we had Tanzanian field staff. They had to be paid, and Hugo helped for a while to help to get money. But it was always a struggle. You had to write these proposals every year.
Gombe's got its problems, hasn't it, now?
We have our 60th anniversary on July the 14th. 60 unbroken years.
Fantastic. But it's not as safe as it was, is it?
Not as safe. Well, Tanzania is pretty safe compared to, but just over the lake, we have DRC, we have Goma, we have a project there as well. Just to the north, we have Burundi, which, as you know, is not very stable right now. Gombe, we did have a kidnapping. 4 students were kidnapped and taken over the lake.
Yes,
And,
but they were released eventually.
Yeah, a huge ransom was paid.
Oh, really? Yes.
By one of the fathers. And that brought the students on the research station to an end back then. And so then it was a real fight for me to get money. Stanford threw me out, so it was my fault. And, but anyway, that's when some wonderful friends in San Francisco set up the Jane Goodall Institute. It was back in 1977.
Oh, yes.
And then we could start raising money, for Gombe, which we're still doing today.
I'm surprised that it's still difficult, with your fame, with all the Roots and Shoots organizations all over the world and all of these things. I'm a bit surprised that, it's not just plain sailing and you can just do what you want.
I can't.
Still can't.
No. We've got 34 Jane Goodall Institutes. We've got our youth program, Roots and Shoots, that you mentioned. That's in 65 countries now. We got some new groups just 2 days ago, and that's in Bhutan.
Really?
Yes.
What is it? Why do people want to be associated with it? What's the attraction?
Of Roots and Shoots? Well, it began in Tanzania with 12 high school students who were concerned about things going on around them in their environment. And some of them worried about the poaching in the national park. Some of them worried about the illegal dynamite fishing, just destroying the coral reefs. Some of them were worried about the street children with no homes. And so I told them to go and get all their friends who felt the same, and we had this big meeting. And we decided, okay, we'll start a program where young people can begin making a difference. They were about 18, 19, 20. And so we decided the main message will be every individual makes a difference every day, and you choose, unless you're very poor, in which case you just have to do what you have to do to live. That each group would choose 3 projects between them. 1 to help people, 1 to help animals, 1 to help the environment, because it's all interrelated. And so it began with those 12 students in Tanzania. It's now in every district of Tanzania. It's in 65 countries, as I say. We got nearly 2,000 groups in China, mainland China.
Really?
Yeah.
And the attraction, what is it?
Because they choose what to do. They get to choose their project. We don't tell them. We do have curricula. Some governments want it. That means the whole school is involved, which is good. And from that sort of growing awareness, the young people who are really passionate, they form the Roots and Shoots groups or clubs. And so we now have members in kindergarten, university, and everything in between. And what they are doing, right now they're planting a lot of trees. We had our 29th birthday in Tanzania, and they were sending Mary Lewis, who's out here somewhere, all these photographs of planting trees. And when I was in Davos, I just helped to launch this trillion tree challenge. So it's been worked out that if we had 1 trillion trees on land that used to be forested, it would absorb all the carbon dioxide that's leading to climate change. But of course, it's going to take a long time, and I don't know that we have so long. But still, it's good to plant the trees.
Are you optimistic at all? I mean, there's not many grounds to be optimistic.
Well, it's very grim, isn't it?
It is.
Politically, socially, environmentally, we're recklessly burning CO2, And you know, the thing people don't think about very often, but these intensive farms with billions of animals in concentration camp-like conditions, and they have to be fed, areas are cleared to grow the grain, fossil fuel is used to get the grain to the animals, to the abattoir, meat to the table. Water, which is getting, as you know, in shorter supply, more contaminated. Lots of water used to turn vegetable to animal protein. And, as I always say to the kids, you know, food comes in here and gas comes out the other end, and that's methane, which is a very virulent greenhouse gas. So these movements towards vegetarianism and veganism are really good. They are helping to save the planet.
But we don't have much time.
We have a closing window.
Yes.
Why do you think
10
I
years?
travel 3? Let's give it a bit more than that. And it's not just me. I talked to some climate experts the other day. If we get together, if we could get governments to sponsor, to subsidize the clean green energy programs that are coming out, instead of continually subsidizing their sponsors, who are the big oil and gas companies. You know, there's many people who've said we could come off the grid and that it would be cheaper. You know, my reasons for hope is, first of all, these young people. Honestly, John, if you could see what they do, they are so imaginative, they're so passionate, and they think up all these things and do them themselves. I was with a school of 400 kids in Berlin 2 days ago, and they had all these things to show me what they were doing. They were doing projects with bees. They were doing a workshop on climate change. It was so inspiring, and that greets me all around the world. And I'm 300 days a year all around the world, meeting hundreds of children with shining eyes wanting to tell Dr. Jane what they've been doing to make the world a better place. And then there's this. Isn't it odd that the most intellectual creature, the biggest difference between us and chimps, is our intellect? How is it possible that this intellectual species is destroying its only home? Seems, don't you think, a disconnect between head and heart? Because I think only when head and heart work in harmony can we attain our true human potential. And so, to finish my reasons for hope, the next one is the resilience of nature. When I began at Gombe in '60, it was part of this equatorial forest belt across Africa. By the '80s, it was a little island of forest. All the forest had gone around it, more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food elsewhere, overused farmland, cutting down trees because they were desperate to feed their growing families. And it really hit me when I flew over and saw that. So JGI, Jane Goodall Institute, we began a program called Takari, which is very holistic, and it started with the 12 villages around Gombe, and it includes things like restoring fertility to the land without pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, all the rest of it. Microcredit opportunities, especially for women, like Muhammad Yunus's Grameen Bank. Scholarships to keep girls in school, family planning information, water management programs, so that the people are now finding ways of making a living without destroying the environment. And they've become our partners in conservation. So this is in 104 villages throughout the whole range of chimps in Tanzania. And the villages provide volunteers who learn how to use smartphones, even if they can't read and write, and they go into their village forest reserves and monitor the health of the villages. Most chimps are not protected. They're in these forest reserves. So that program is in 6 other African countries where there are chimps. And of course, Roots and Shoots is part of all of that. And then the last reason for hope is the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems impossible and they won't give up.
And chimps, do they have a future?
Oh, they do have a future. And I dare to say that this Takari program has already saved many chimps and many forests. And by saving the chimp, you must save the forest. And by saving the forest, you save everything else that lives in it, all this rich biodiversity.